supply shock, as it reduces the capacity in energy-intensive industries. And when an economy is faced with a negative supply shock, then the optimal policy is tighter fiscal policy and looser monetary policy. The reason is that when you have less supply, then demand has to come down also. And if the government doesn't decrease its demand or even increases its demand, then the decline of demand in the private sector is even larger. And you can have ultimately only higher inflation that forces then the demand in the private sector to come down. And you need looser monetary policy in the terms that real interest rates should be relatively low, because a negative supply shock means that the cost of capital should be lower, because also the returns to capital are lower. Now, that's also an example of an optimal an optimal policy reaction that is not always followed. The first instinct of policymakers is always, when you have a slowdown in GDP, a slowdown in income, that you need fiscal stimulus. And that in this kind of a situation would just lead to more inflation. It would lead to the need for tighter monetary policy. So the opposite of what you actually need. Now, at the moment, there's not much danger of too tight monetary policy, because across the world, and I think also in Pakistan, the real interest rates are negative because of the high inflation. So there is scope for a rise in nominal interest rates. So that's my first example, with a bit of a sidestep to the overall policy response of a major crisis that is bad news. In the case of the war in Ukraine, of course, first of all, bad news for the people in Ukraine, a terrible situation, but also in economic terms for countries like Pakistan, and then that it can lead to structural shifts. The acceleration of the energy transition would be positive. So let me shift now to another ongoing crisis going on for the last 2 years, and what the impact of that crisis was on Pakistan, and what the opportunities are that potentially emerge from that crisis. And that's obviously the COVID pandemic. Not only in Pakistan, not only in the whole of South Asia, but in the whole of the world, that led to a major economic crisis. It was also a negative supply shock, like an oil price shock. We saw contractions in GDP that we had never seen before. That's that kind of a scale. And also in Pakistan, the fiscal year 2019-20, per capita real GDP, I think, came down. It shrank more than 3%. 1%, more than 1% shrinking of GDP, but then with a population growth of 2%, you have per capita production declining more than 3%. And not only it was a very severe crisis, it was also a unique crisis with very special characteristics, and that's partly because, as I said, it was a supply shock. It was not a normal cyclical demand-driven crisis. And one way to illustrate that is that in that same year, the fiscal year 2019-2020, In Pakistan, per capita consumption shrank more than 5%. So that's a lot more than the decline in production, and that's not normal at all, because normally during downturns you see that there is consumption smoothing. Households will borrow a bit to smooth out consumption over time, and you see that consumption is declining much less than production. Here it was the other way around, and that is a major indication that there was a supply shock. The lockdowns just made it impossible to consume, and for the people who did not lose their work, it was actually difficult to spend money, and you had a lot of pent up demand. Now, after that first year, there was a strong rebound. Partly because of actually very good policy responses in Pakistan, a very quick response in terms of relief efforts, support to households. There was also a good policy response by the central bank, supporting firms to survive despite of the lockdowns. Um, there was an impressive health response with a sharp pickup of vaccinations. Uh, so partly because of good policy responses, there was a strong rebound in the subsequent year. But even if you look at per capita consumption over the first 2 years, it was still negative per capita consumption growth. So that is one illustration of why the COVID pandemic was such a severe but also unique crisis. It was also unique because this time around the informal sector was hit very hard. The informal sector, where you have self-employed people, very small firms working in domestic services, they are normally not at all that cyclical. During crisis, they can still continue to function because they are not working in cyclical sectors. This time was very different. It was very difficult for people in the informal sector to continue to function because of social distancing rules. They had not many opportunities to circumvent that, unlike the bigger companies. You had also the migrant workers in the informal sector that were hit hard. And that all puts the inequality between front and center. There were other signs that inequality increased in Pakistan. One area where you saw it was in the economic consequences for women. They were harsher and they lasted longer than for men. So a unique characteristic of this crisis, and one of the problems that was revealed by the crisis, was the inequality in Pakistan. And then finally, an important characteristic of the crisis was that, as I said before, during many other crises, new technologies emerged, and they got a boost to solve the problems that emerged during the crisis. And in this case, it were the digital solutions to circumvent the problems that were created by the lockdowns. It was what we call the new service economy, that got an enormous boost. Now, these new technologies, they create also opportunities in the longer run for Pakistan. And as in the case of higher oil prices, where you have longer term opportunities, also in this case, you have opportunities. And that comes on top of the lessons to be learned about the increased inequality. Um, there are in two ways, I think, new opportunities because of the new service economy. We wrote in last October in our fall issue of the South Asia Economic Focus about these new service economy. That the first opportunity is that there are possibilities now to become a lot more active in producing these services because there's so much demand for new digital services. And that is very good news for Pakistan. Let me take a step back and briefly summarize the story that we told in that South Asia economic focus on the new service economy. So the story is that historically, manufacturing used to play a pivotal role in middle income countries, like Pakistan is a lower middle income country. Historically, manufacturing was very important at that level of development because manufacturing could absorb surplus labor from agriculture and use them to produce for exports and produce goods also that make other sectors more productive. And especially the opportunity created by manufacturing to export are very important at this level of development because it generates income to buy necessary other products from abroad. But perhaps even more importantly, the competition in international markets, they create knowledge and they increase productivity even more. So that's the historical role of manufacturing. But Pakistan has never become really a manufacturing powerhouse, has never been able to be very successful in manufacturing. Now, the story of manufacturing has changed towards services in recent years. Services have become now a lot more tradable across borders. And so also with services, you can generate these export revenues and you can compete in international markets, which creates a lot of new knowledge. And services, and especially the information systems, they have become the main driver of productivity in other sectors. No, not anymore just the capital goods produced by manufacturing, but the information systems are driving productivity increase in agricultural, in services, in transportation, in lots of other sectors. Now this first way in which Pakistan can benefit from the new service economy that got such a boost during the crisis of the pandemic is because Pakistan has good universities and talented students. And I've seen that in Karachi, I've seen it in many other cities. There is a real potential in Pakistan to become more active in these new service economies. There's a second way in which Pakistan can benefit from these new services, and that is that it can increase productivity in the informal sector, the same sector that was hit so hard in the crisis, uh, because it can create opportunities for very small firms to sell their services on e-commerce platforms or use ride-sharing platforms or use matching platforms where their services can find consumers that want these services. They get access to digital payment systems, which ultimately can lead to financial inclusion, which is very important to increase productivity in the informal sector. And it is even it is even possible using these kind of new technologies, the new service economy for very small firms to uh, to start penetrating international markets, to start exporting. Um, and in general, I think there's a strong case to be made that these new technologies, they are especially useful for the very large informal and till now not very productive informal sector in Pakistan. And that is because these new technologies, they really change the way countries are producing products and services. They are changing the way the labor market is functioning. They're changing the way we do commerce, and that all fits the characteristics of the informal sector. So if I'm in a bold mood, then I often say that the digital revolution, the digital technologies, they turn completely upside down everything that we know since the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. The Industrial Revolution, that was all about economies of scale. You had production being concentrated in big factories. But now with the digital technologies, you see a fragmentation of production. It's possible with very small units to be part of a value chain and to be as a small unit economically viable. During and after the Industrial Revolution, you had standardization of products in big factories. Now, with the digital technologies, you have customization of products. It's very easy to customize your product for a specific consumer. The Industrial Revolution, they created the wage workers, the employees, and that became the defining way the labor market was functioning. But now you see also in high income countries that wage workers become gig workers, they become self employed, and they no longer have a job, but they're doing activities. Again, very much like the informal sector work. But when you look at the last 200 years, it was all about concentration of activities and urbanization. And I think now a decentralization is possible. So my view is that the crisis that was so harsh and that was so damaging compared to previous crises and so unique also really creates new opportunities because that change in technologies in both ways in opportunities for very skilled young people coming out of universities, but also for the informal sector that for a long time till now has been almost left out uh, of the markets and of the financial sector. But these opportunities, the story repeats itself. They are not coming automatically. They're not being realized automatically. What has to be done to seize these opportunities in the new service economy is that you have to allow a more international competition in services. You have to focus on the regulation of the new service economies, a regulation that works for everybody, including for those in the informal sector. And so it becomes very important to listen good to the private sector. What works, what doesn't work, what are the obstacles to benefit from these new opportunities. And it is important in Pakistan to take the informal sector seriously in policy making, and don't just focus on what I call the insiders in the formal sector, because ultimately in the long run the biggest opportunities are in the informal sector, when you can give access to markets and finance to the people who are now largely excluded. It is also important to realize that this was not a normal crisis of a cyclical nature that determined how you respond, but it also means that after a rebound in GDP growth, we are not back to normal. There is a new normal across the world and also in Pakistan. The crisis had led to structural changes and to new opportunities. And I think it will be really rewarding for Pakistan if you can seize on these new opportunities. So difficult times for Pakistan. One crisis on top of another, while Pakistan entered the pandemic already with major economic challenges, especially because of the fiscal and the balance of payment situation. Then came the pandemic, and now is coming the rise in commodity prices, partly pushed by the war in Ukraine. A very difficult situation, but the point I'm trying to make, and I'm not sure it's very clear because, as I said, it's after midnight here, but the point that I want to make is that there are real opportunities coming out of this crisis for Pakistan. And it is important that not just policymakers, but also people in the private sector don't just think short term and be in a crisis mode, but link their policies, their investments, their activities to the longer term prospects. Let me leave it here. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Hans, for such an insightful session. Let's move on to question and answers, and I'll take it from the front first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmer, for your very insightful and deep talk about the crisis, which is really at the heart of all the challenges in our country. And I really truly believe that without working around this crisis, our country has no good future and no good present. I've been working in this area for the last 6 years, and I really feel really deep pain in my heart when we think about people living in small villages, small cities and the towns, and they do not have electricity like for 10 hours a day, because especially the rich people in cities can always switch to like generators or put like panels on their rooftop, and really they are living a good life, but not the common man. Now I have worked on the economic and like environmental effects of of electricity, like different angles of electricity in Pakistan, and I would love to share my recent paper with you. In fact, I might come to World Bank like in 2 weeks or so. I hope to see you there if I come. Like Vivian Foster, chief economist, so she knows me pretty well. So I come to the question. The question is that your story in Pakistan is of love and hate. You are loved because you rescue us at the time of crisis. You give us money, and we thank you for that. But you are hated because you tell us that dislodge subsidies. You tell us to increase tariff. So all that story, when really put on the common people, they think that you are being very unfair to us because we really do not have the capacity to pay that high level of bills that you want us to pay. But I can also understand where you come from, because if the cost per unit of electricity is less than
Excuse me, sir. We're a bit short on time, so
Okay.
can you please go to your question?
All right. So what I'm saying is I'm very, very amazed when I look at the energy crisis in our country. Like one side is subsidy, other side is people who really cannot pay that much. On the other side is the government that really wants to have very good relationship with you because they want money from you. So my question is that where do you think, how can we really realistically solve this problem for Pakistan, where about 70% of our electricity is generated using fossil fuel and it has huge environmental effect, and others are really not very so dependable in terms of their constant production. And second question is that you give aid to us, and there is a huge literature which says that aid really doesn't work because of bad institutions in developing countries, right? Now, I have a paper too, like a long time ago, which was published in JIMF, which is that the relative effectiveness of aid versus private loans. And it's not just me, but there are many big names who have really published in big academic journals as well as policy journals, and they suggest that aid really is not that effective. It goes to here and there and blah, 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 so I will not really go into that. So what I'm saying is this, that why don't you think about an alternative solution where you can provide aid through private banks with a targeted program? So what I'm saying is, why don't you underwrite aid in such a way that aid, instead of going, I'm not saying all the aid, some aid needs to go to the government, but like targeted aid like education or for the farmers or so on, where you can really give that aid to, for example, Habib Bank in Pakistan, and ask farmers, if you need loan, then take it from there, give back with the interest rate, so they can internalize the cost and benefit of taking loans or all that. So I think you got my point, so I will leave it up to you for the comments.
Mr. Hans, we'll take another question and then you can answer them all together.
Mr. Hans, this is Mohammed Haris from Punjab University. I wish you the best of the health. I would like to ask regarding the World Bank's policy in the case to reduce poverty and inequality in the South Asian and lower middle income countries, especially in the case of inequality, that how is World Bank planning after the pandemic to reduce inequality in these countries? Thank you.
I am Muhammad Ali Brar from University of the Punjab. I want to ask a question. Pakistan need more productive potential as well as more productive efficiency. But if we want to increase our productive potential, more resources are required to induce. But on the other side, when we look about the productive efficiency, we have a huge loss in every production process. So due to limited resources, Pakistan has to make a trade-off between productive potential and productive efficiency. So in your view, what will be the more beneficial for Pakistan to increase potential or to increase efficiency?
Yes, Mr. Hans, you may speak now.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let me first start with love and hate. We are loved, but we are also hated. And we are hated because we advocate that the subsidies on energy should be reduced, which implies higher tariffs. And so this is exactly why it is so difficult for policymakers to reduce these kind of subsidies because they are seen as so important. And this is why it is relatively easy for me as an economist to promote this kind of a policy. But still, let me give the arguments for that. The problem with the subsidies are twofold. First of all, they are not only reaching the poor, they are reaching a lot of rich people that don't actually need them. That is one problem, and in a lot of studies we come to the conclusion that these kind of subsidies are actually regressive. It is very inefficient if you want to support the most vulnerable households to subsidize prices because that lowers the price for everybody else. It is much more efficient to give cash transfers to have a good functioning social safety net system. And this is an area where Pakistan has made progress during the crisis also, because so many people were in need. And using digital technologies, the social protection system has improved. So that's one problem with it. I'm not denying that the vulnerable households should be protected, but they can be protected in a much better and more efficient way. The second problem is, as the one who asked the question was very interested in environmental problems, that when you keep energy prices low, there's no incentive in society to accelerate that transition towards renewable energies. So I realize that it's easy for me as an economist. It's easy for me to be hated. It's much more difficult for policymakers to be hated. But I still think it is important to lay out the economic arguments. So how do we try to help reduce inequality that has always existed, but that has deepened, has widened during the crisis? I think it's in a couple of areas. It's our focus on service delivery, especially in healthcare and education, because we saw a major discrepancy during the crisis, a major divide. Rich people had much easier access to healthcare. For richer people, it was easier for their kids to learn remotely, which was very difficult for poor kids in remote areas. And so to invest in these services in a way that there's universal access and you close that gap, that is one way of reducing inequality. It is helping governments, including the government of Pakistan, setting up a more targeted, efficient social protection systems. But ultimately, my view, although these are very important elements, the universal access to services and a good social safety net, ultimately it is giving people opportunities to become more productive and to increase their income. And that is why I personally am so focused on increasing more opportunity of the 80-90% of the population in Pakistan that works in the informal sector. It is so important to make sure that they can get better access to markets and to finance. And then finally, on efficiency, you hear that often, the complaint that there's no efficiency and productivity in Pakistan, and as a result of that, it's very difficult to compete. I think that's not fundamentally true. There's a lot of potential in Pakistan, and again, just based on my visits to university, there's a lot of talent in Pakistan. There shouldn't be a problem in being competitive in international markets. Here, I think we should all have a good look at what is happening in big companies and in the formal sector. When I talked to many CEOs in Pakistan, they advocate for higher import tariffs. They want to be protected. They argue that that is important to protect the jobs that they have been created. But we have to realize that when you are protected as big companies and you are pretty comfortable in the domestic economy because you don't have a lot of competition from foreigners and you don't have a lot of competition from the informal sector, then that results in inefficiency and a lack of dynamism and a lack of innovation. And so to make sure that you can compete in international markets, you have to be open to international competition also. And you have to allow also on the import side competition. And that will make it possible that you become more competitive in international markets also. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with Pakistan, with the people in Pakistan. There is lots of opportunities. And as I said, especially in these new sectors that are coming up now. But you have to make yourself vulnerable. You shouldn't be too comfortable, especially in large companies. That's it for me.
So we'll take two more questions.
I would like to ask, as you rightly mentioned, that the economic crisis has drastically hit the informal sector in Pakistan. So as also asked the question before, that the inequalities, we have seen a lot of inequalities, especially hitting the most vulnerable households. So my question is there any focus of the World Bank to the most vulnerable people, like transgender persons, like women, and the other, World Bank is apparently more focused on the macro level. Does it have focus at the household level, or more like the micro level at the household level? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sadaf from Punjab University. My question is based on the demographic transition. As I was listening, you said that by increasing the social safety nets, cash transfers, and all these measures can improve the efficiency. But recently I was doing a research on social protection and its channels, and I have actually investigated the direct and indirect impacts of social protection. But what I have found that it hampers the growth, it hampers the efficiency. Basically, the cash transfers makes the public sluggish and lethargic towards the productive activities. So what World Bank suggests us to how we make our demographic transition, as Pakistan is experiencing a very good share of demographic transitions nowadays. So I guess social protection makes the growth sluggish. There should be some other measures which can help to improve the efficiency of the productive labor. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your insights. I'm Rahmana Ghafoor from Sakhara University. So as global factors like war in Ukraine and national factors like political instability affect the economy of Pakistan, I want to ask that as an economist, what factors would you suggest that can help to stabilize the economy of Pakistan and we can totally avoid borrowing from the IMF? Thank you.
Back to Mr. Hans.
Thanks a lot again. So first, the question, are we focused on the most vulnerable? Are we actually focusing on households and on the micro level? And the suggestion was that we are only focusing on the macro. I actually hope that everybody realizes that we are almost solely focused on the micro level and on the most vulnerable. That is our mission, and most of our support is going in that direction, providing the services for the most vulnerable. It is more the IMF that is focused on macroeconomic stability, but obviously to be able to focus on the micro level, we need also to take into account what is happening in the macroeconomic environment, because that should be conducive to be effective at the micro level, but a focus on the most vulnerable, that is at the core of what we are trying to do. Then the potential negative impact of cash transfers. Two responses to that. First of all, there are ways of designing cash transfers that they don't discourage entering into the labor force and become productive. So that means that some of the support you don't immediately lose when you start generating income yourself. That's a design issue. And the second response is that indeed it is true that the ultimate solution is not coming from continued cash transfers. That is a safety net. It is not the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution is providing opportunities for people to generate their own income. And again, that is why I'm stressing so much the focus on the informal sector. Why aren't the opportunities larger for the people in the informal sector? What are the constraints for them to compete more? How can Pakistan borrow less from the IMF? In general, obviously, there's nothing against from time to time borrowing from the IMF, because they can help overcome a crisis, but the IMF steps in when there is a crisis. So when you want to avoid borrowing from the IMF, it is important to avoid a crisis which is mainly a balance of payment crisis and is mainly a fiscal crisis and a debt crisis. That is where the IMF can help, which means that it is important to put in place long-term policies that prevent overspending by the government and overspending by society, so that you have to borrow too much, so that at some point you face the balance of payment challenges where you need. So that is about long-term structural macro policies. And it is also about a vibrant private sector that can create more exports, because when your exports are larger, it is also easier to deal with fluctuations in international financial markets, and you're reducing the balance of payment challenges. The IMF is not eager to step in, but it is a good tool that once you are in that situation, then you get some time to survive that situation and to put the macroeconomic house in order. Thank you so much for all these questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hans, for your time. Parallel tech sessions participants, please head to your respective rooms. And now the country director for World Bank Pakistan would be closing the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Najib Al-Hassi. I'm country director for World Bank. I'd like to thank my colleague Hans for giving this talk at midnight or past midnight. I just wanted to make as a closing to second what my colleague mentioned. I would encourage you all to go to the website of the World Bank, where there's a description of our portfolio and all our operation in Pakistan. So to your question, as my colleague mentioned, most of our engagements and our loans to the government of Pakistan are focused on interventions that are more micro, that in education, in health, in transport, that are focused on the poorest segments of society. We work on macro, we work on energy reforms, we work on more broad-based reform, but most of our engagements and investments are actually focused on the very poor, including the engagements on social protection. And I'd like also to second what my colleague Hans mentioned. There's now many studies around the world that show that cash transfers don't reduce incentives to supply labor or to enter in the job market. And there are studies in Pakistan, in Punjab in particular, that shows that BISP over the years has no negative impact on labor supply. So I just wanted to make these complementary points to what Hans Timmer mentioned. On this, I would like to thank you all, and I'm so happy to be here, and hopefully I can meet a number of students in the corridors and in between sessions. Thank you very much for a great session and great moderation. Thanks again, Hans.
Those who have to go to the tech sessions, please head to your respected rooms. Thank you.